So this is our ongoing discussion of Simondon's individuation in light of notions of form and information. We're starting from page 291 of the translation. So we're on the part on psychical individuation, and then we're just going to start the chapter Psychical Individuation and the Problematic of Ontogenesis. Last time we looked at the last section of the previous chapter, which had to do with affection and its relation with, we have these sort of two series. We have the series that goes from affection to emotion, and then we have the series that goes from sensation to perception. And then those two series have to be united in the collective. So we saw an extended development on the tropistic character of sensation. So sensation is always a relationship of the individual to some sort of gradient in the environment, and there's a sort of unity between the sensation and the response. Psychology that focuses solely on one side or the other is sort of breaking down this unified tropistic nature of sensation. And so whether it's a behaviorism that only looks at the response side or a sort of introspective psychology that only looks at the sensation side, either way, you're sort of breaking up this unity of the tropistic nature of sensation. And then likewise, affectivity also has this relation to something like a gradient, but in time rather than outside of the individual. So affectivity is a sort of relation of the individual to the lifespan of that individual. So it's an insertion into a lifespan. There's a sort of temporal structure that affectivity is inserted into. And then affectivity and sensation are both sort of partial. They have this partial character that is only resolved through unification. So multiple different sensations, each sensation defines a sort of dimension or a polarization of the world. And it's only through the unification of multiple sensation dimensions that you end up with something like an object, a perception of an object. And likewise with affection, you have these multiple gradients or multiple polarizations into pleasure and pain or joy and sadness or whatever sets of opposed affective states. And then it's only through a process of unification that you have emotion as a result, which is a sort of consistent state, whereas the affective states are transitory in some sense. So emotion has this property of persistence, so that an individual who is in a certain emotional state will tend to continue to be in that emotional state, whereas affectivity doesn't have that same continuity to it. And then we saw the last bit of the chapter was a little bit difficult to fit together with some of the other previous parts, because he suggests in that last half page or so, he suggests that perception and emotion are activities that can be carried out at the level of the individual, whereas previously he had said that emotion is not something that the individual can carry out on their own. So he suggests that perception and emotion are carried out at the level of the individual, and then the unification of perception and emotion is what happens at the level of the collective. So it seems like there's sort of a slippage of sense of what he's talking about with emotion, whether it's specifically the individual side of emotion, so emotion insofar as it occurs in an individual, or emotion as something more collective, something that an individual only has insofar as they're inserted into a collective. So there's sort of this movement between these two senses, but the bigger picture is that the unification of the whole psychic apparatus, or the unification of the emotional side and the perceptual side, only happens at the level of the collective and not at the level of the individual. So that's more or less where we left off. Okay, so I'll start reading from the beginning of the new chapter, and then we can go around from there. Psychical Individuation and the Problem of Ontogenesis. Section 1. Signification as Criterion of Individuation. The difference between signal and signification is important because it constitutes an accurate and essential criterion for the distinction between a veritable individuation or individualization and the functioning of a non-individuated subset. Static criteria, like those of material limits and those of the body of each individual, are not sufficient. Certain cases, e.g. association, parasitism, and gestation, cannot be studied using spatial or purely somatic criteria in the usual, i.e. anatomical, physiological sense of the term. According to the distinction between signals and signification, we will say that there is an individual when there is a process of real individuation, i.e. when significations appear. The individual is that through which and in which significations appear, whereas there are only signals between individuals. The individual is the being that appears when there is signification. Reciprocally, there is signification only when an individuated being appears or persists in the being undergoing individualization. The genesis of the individual corresponds to the resolution of a problem that could not be resolved in accordance with the previous data, since they had no axiomatic in common. The individual is the self-constitution of a topology of the being that resolves a previous incompatibility via the appearance of a new systematics. What was tension and incompatibility becomes functioning structure. Fixed and fruitless tension becomes an organization of functioning. Instability is transformed into an organized metastability that is perpetuated and stabilized in its capacity to change. The individual is therefore a spatial-temporal axiomatic of the being that makes compatible previously antagonistic data in a system with temporal and spatial dimensions. The individual is a being that becomes, according to its structure, in time, and is structured according to its becoming. Tension becomes tendency. What merely depended on the instant before individuation becomes order in the successiveness of the continuous. The individual is what introduces a system according to space and time, with a mutual convertibility of order according to space, structure, and of order according to time, becoming, tendency, development, and aging. In a word, function. Signals are spatial or temporal. A signification is spatial-temporal. It has two senses, one with respect to a structure and the other with respect to a functional becoming. Significations constitute something of the individual being, though they require a preliminary existence of the partially individuated being. A being is never completely individualized. To exist, it must have the power to continue individualizing by resolving the problems of the milieu that surrounds it, and that is its milieu. The living being is a being that perpetuates itself by exerting or resolving action on the milieu. It brings with it the initiations of resolution, since it is alive. But when it effectuates these resolutions, it effectuates them at the limit of its being, and thereby continues the individuation. This individuation after the initial individuation is individualizing for the individual to the extent that it is resolving for the milieu. According to this manner of viewing individuation, a specific psychical operation would be a discovery of significations in an ensemble of signals, since signification would extend the being's initial individuation, and in this sense have a rapport both to the ensemble of exterior objects as well as to the being itself. Insofar as it contributes a solution to a plurality of signals, a signification has a bearing toward the exterior, but this exterior is not foreign to the being as the result of an individuation. This is because before the individuation, this being was not distinct from the ensemble of the being that separated into milieu and individual. In the same way, the discovery of a significative solution has a bearing toward the interior of the being and increases for it the intelligibility of its relation to the world. The world is merely the individual's complementary with respect to an initial indivision. Individualization continues individuation. Each thought, each conceptual discovery, each affective emergence is a recurrence of the initial individuation. Each develops as a recurrence of the schema of the initial individuation of which it is a distant, partial, but faithful rebirth. If knowledge rediscovers the lines that allow the world to be interpreted according to stable laws, this is not because in the subject there are a priori forms of sensibility whose coherence with the raw data emerging from the world through sensation would be inexplicable. This is because the being as subject and the being as object arise from the same initial reality, and because the thought that now seems to establish an inexplicable relation between the object and the subject in fact merely extends this initial individuation. The conditions of possibility of knowledge are in fact the individual being's causes of existence. let's stop there. This is one of these giant paragraphs with no good stopping point, but let's stop there. So here we have this introduction of a new notion that we haven't seen in previous parts of the book, which is individualization, which is a sort of prolonging of the process of individuation. So a process of individuation always is always partial in the sense that there's always something pre-individual that remains after the process of individuation. And so individualization is a sort of secondary or prolonged process of individuation. So it takes something pre-individual in the milieu surrounding the individual, and it undergoes a further process of individuation. And we'll see more on what exactly that means and sort of what the relationship is between individuation and individualization. We'll see more as we go along. But you can already see here there's and we'll see more as we go along too, but he's already contrasting the position that he's setting out here with the Kantian position. So he suggests that Kant's position, according to which there's a priori forms of sensibility that are imposed in some sense on sensations or some sort of effect of the world on the subject. So this position, Simondon thinks, is not a coherent one because it doesn't explain how the sensations emerging from the effects of the world on me sort of line up or cohere with the forms of sensibility that inhere in me. And so instead, what Simondon wants to argue is that our knowledge of the world, or the possibility of knowledge of the world, has to do with the fact that the subject and the object are both the results of the same initial individuation process. So we only know the world insofar as our individuation and individualization are results of this initial unity of the individual with the world, or of this initial pre-individual state out of which the individual and the world will eventually emerge. And we'll see more criticism of Kant or of a Kantian position later on as well.
Do you think that this co-individuation of individual and world is at the vital level or at the psychic level, or both, I guess? I don't know. I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around this idea that they emerge simultaneously, and out of what, I guess.
Yeah, I think we'll see more on this in subsection 3 of this chapter. So in that chapter, he's going to talk about, in that subsection, he's going to talk about bisubstantialism, so the doctrine of the mind and the body as two separate substances that have some sort of interaction with each other. And he's going to suggest that there isn't a psychic individuation in the proper sense. There's a psychic individualization. So the vital individuation. So individuation happens at the level of vital individuation. So we have the formation of an individual living being, and then it's only as a sort of secondary prolongation of that individuation that we have something like psychic individualization. So I think as a sort of first approximation, we can think of individuation as vital individuation, and then individualization as the psychic level. Although it'll become more complicated than that as we go along, but that's sort of like a first go around. We can start from that point.
I have a brief question. It seems early on that he favors the idea of becoming, and he doesn't give much explanation. Maybe privileges the process of becoming, and an order according to time sees becoming as more entwined with time than space. Early on, he says, the individual is what introduces a system according to space and time, with a mutual convertibility of order according to space, parentheses, structure, and of order according to time. And then he gives these various forms of becoming as process of time, like becoming, tendency, development, and aging. It seems like he finds those to be within the set of time, and it's just interesting. I thought that he might be privileging becoming, and I'm not exactly sure what to make of that, because maybe he says signals are spatial or temporal, and the signification is spatio-temporal. So signification in its relation to becoming is spatio-temporal, but it's not exactly clear to me. He doesn't seem as of yet to flesh out what particularly is spatial. So maybe he has, and you guys can clarify that.
Right. I think you're right that there is a sort of privileging of the temporal or of the notion of becoming, because he wants to. So the sort of general method of this whole book is an ontogenetic method. So it's trying to account for being through its arising or through its genesis, and that's the sort of general method. But I think what he might say also is that, and we saw this in the introduction, and we'll see it again in the conclusion, is that for him, time itself is something that arises, that has a genesis. So when he talks about becoming, there's a sort of dual sense to the word, because it can mean the becoming in the sense of the arising of time or the genesis of time itself, which of course can't in turn be temporal, or it can mean becoming in the order of time. So like the development of an organism or something like that. So there's a sort of dual sense of becoming in Simondon. And so Angus, that's right. He for Simondon, time is not something given; it's something that arises out of this initial pre-individual state. We saw that in the introduction, and it was sort of stated in passing, or not really emphasized that much in the introduction, but I think we'll see it again in the conclusion, that he'll talk about time as something that has a genesis. So I think that's how he would sort of answer that, is that genesis is a category that is more fundamental than time, and then time would be something like our apprehension of Genesis, or we would only apprehend the genesis of a being through time, but that genesis would not itself be temporal. And then Angus had another question about going back to this notion of the relationship between individuation and individualization. And so the question is our ability to understand the world, is it a result of our initial vital individuation? And then would conceptual discoveries be recurrences of our vital genesis? I think to some extent the answer is yes. So, of course, living beings, non-human animals, have some sort of capacity to understand the world. They can identify, predators and prey, or potential mates, or home, or not home, or different locations in an environment, and so on. So they have this capacity to orient themselves towards different parts of the world and different objects in appropriate ways. And so that sort of basic capacity to understand the world in that sense is something that already arises with vital individuation. And this is, it's not even just animals, but bacteria, even plants have. There's been some stuff on plant cognition, like plants will orient themselves towards resources in the environment, like the growth pattern of roots is a sort of exploratory pattern that finds water and other resources in the soil, and things like that. So you have, at a very basic level of vital individuation, you already have some sort of understanding of the world in a very broad sense. And so I think even in human beings, I think that sort of basic understanding of the world, or that basic orientation towards different aspects of the world, is something that comes from vital individuation. And then you would have more sophisticated or more elaborate sort of performances would be results of individualization that prolongs our initial vital individuation. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So I think I stopped right at the top of 293. So if we start from individualization differentiates beings, if someone else would like to read.
I can read. Individualization differentiates beings with respect to one another, but it also weaves relations among them. It links them to one another because the schemata according to which individuation follows its course are shared by a certain number of circumstances that can be reproduced for several subjects. The de jure universality of knowledge is indeed a de jure universality. But this universality passes through the mediation of conditions of individualization, which are identical for all beings placed in the same circumstances and with the same foundations of individuation from the start. Because individuation is universal, just like the foundation of the relation between subject and object, knowledge is validly given as universal. The opposition of the empirical subject and the transcendental subject overlaps that of the subject reached here and now at a certain result of its personal individualization, and that of the same subject as expressing a single act carried out once and for all of individuation. The subject, as the result of an individuation that it incorporates, is a milieu of a prioris. The subject, as the milieu, an agent of the progressive discoveries of signification in the signals that come from the world, is the principle of the a posteriori. The individuated being is the transcendental subject, and the individualized being is the empirical subject. However, it is not absolutely legitimate to attribute to the transcendental subject a responsibility in the choice of the empirical subject's character. The transcendental subject does not operate a choice. It is itself choice, the concretization of a founding choice of the being. This being exists to the extent that it is a solution, but it is not the being qua individual that existed prior to the choice and that is the principle of the choice. This is the ensemble, the system from which this being has emerged and in which it did not pre-exist as individuated. The notion of transcendental choice introduces individuality too far upstream. There is no transcendental character, and this is precisely why knowledge is universalizable. Problems are problems for the transcendental ego, and the sole character, the empirical character, is the set of these problem solutions. The schemata according to which problems can be resolved are true for every individuated being relative to the same mode of individuation, whereas the particular aspects of each solution contribute to constructing the empirical character. The only character that is constituted is the empirical character. The transcendental subject is that through which there is a problem. But for there to be problems, there must be experience. And the transcendental subject cannot operate a choice before all experience. There can be no choice of the principles of choice before the act of choice. We could call personality everything that connects the individual qua individuated being to the individual qua individualized being. The individualized being tends towards singularity and incorporates the accidental as singularity. The individual qua individuated being itself exists relative to the system of being from which it arises, on which it is formed. On which it is formed, but it is not opposed to other individuals formed according to the same operations of individuation. Should I just finish this section? Or should I?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
It's okay. The being, insofar as it is individualized, diverges from other beings that are individualized. By contrast, this mixture of individuation and individualization that constitutes personality is the differentiated and asymmetrical relation with others. A relation on the level of individuation is a relation of the sexuality type. A relation on the level of individualization is of the type concerning the contingent events of everyday life. Lastly, a relation on the level of personality is one that integrates sexuality and the events of the individual's history into a single situation. What constitutes the human concretely is neither pure individuation nor pure individualization, but a mixture of the two. The character that pure individualization would be is never a detached result. It only becomes so if this relational activity that the permanence of personality constitutes stop being able to unite individuation and individualization. In this sense, the unstable person, the caractériel, I think, is not one who has troubles concerning their character, but one in whom the character tends to become detached, since the personality can no longer assume its dynamic role. What is ill in the unstable person is the personality, not the character. Personality is thus a relational activity between principle and result. Personality is what produces the being's unity between its foundations of universality and the particularities of individualization. The inter-individual relation is not always interpersonal. It is quite insufficient to appeal to a communication of consciousnesses to define the interpersonal relation. An interpersonal relation is a common mediation between the individuation and individualization of a being and the individuation and individualization of another being. In order for this single mediation that is valid for two individuations and two individualizations to be possible, there must be a separate community of individuations and individualizations. The interpersonal relation does not exist on the level of constituted personalities, but on the level of the two poles of each of these personalities. The community cannot intervene after the personalities are constituted. A preliminary community of the conditions of the personality allows for the formation of a single mediation, of a single personality for two individuations and two individualizations. This is why it is rare that the domain of the interpersonal is in fact veritably coextensive with the entire reality of each of the personalities. The interpersonal relation only involves a certain zone of each of the personalities. But the particular coherence of each of the personalities makes it seem like the community exists for the whole ensemble of the two personalities. The two personalities have a part that is veritably in common, but also a part that is not. The two parts that are not in common are joined by the part in common. This is a question of partial identity and of the connection through this identity, rather than a question of communication. Consciousnesses would not be enough to guarantee a communication. There must be a communication of the conditions of consciousnesses for there to be a communication of consciousnesses.
Thanks. So there's a lot going on in this bit. So let's go through it sort of in order. Let's see, where did we start off?
Yeah, I was going to say there's like 3 different subtexts that he goes into, 3 different parts.
Yeah, there's definitely at least 3. We might be able to break it down even further than that. But yeah, so let's start with this bit on the universality of knowledge. So this is again, like I think this whole section is sort of riffing on Kant or in dialogue with Kant, and so this universality of knowledge was part of the problem of what Kant was trying to solve with this idea of synthetic a priori knowledge. So the question is, what, like, our experience of the world is always only a particular event. So you I don't know, you see the match and then you see the fire, but you don't ever see something like the universality that all matches when struck light or something like that. You only ever see particular events or experience particular events, but somehow we are able to have knowledge of universals, like all bodies are heavy or something like that. And so Kant argues that we have this synthetic a priori knowledge. So we have certain knowledge that comes about not through experience, but through the conditions of experience. So it's only because certain conditions are met that we can have anything like an experience at all. And that's sort of the basis of the universality of knowledge is through these conditions of experience. So Simondon is going to, I guess, give us an alternate explanation for the universality of knowledge. So it has to do not with the conditions of possibility of experience, but the conditions of individuation and individualization. So individuation here has to do with a sort of first level individuation. So it's the formation of something like a knowing subject in the first place is a process of individuation, whereas the formation of this particular person as a knowing subject or who is a knowing subject is a process of individualization. And then so he introduces or he takes these terms from Kant, the empirical subject and the transcendental subject. And then so the empirical subject is just a human being as this particular human being. So a person that has, various experiences and preferences and knowledge and so on. Everything about this person is particularized, whereas the transcendental subject here is the human being insofar as they are a knowing subject, but not particularized to not particularized to be one particular person. And so this, of course, raises the question of what the relationship is between this empirical subject and the transcendental subject. And again, Simondon is going to sort of present an alternative to Kant's presentation of this. So for Kant, in the Critique of Practical Reason, he gives this pretty weird explanation of the relationship between empirical subject and transcendental subject. So the problem in that book that Kant, or one of the problems that Kant wants to solve in that book, is if our moral choices in some sense depend on our character. So whether you're a brave or a cowardly person, or whether you're generous or stingy or whatever other properties of a person's character that might be relevant to moral decision making. So if our moral character depends on if our moral decision making depends on our character, in what sense can we be held accountable for that decision making? It seems as if our decision making is in some sense a result of our character, and would accordingly be outside of our control. And for Kant, we can only ever be held accountable for what's under our control. And then so Kant sort of bites the bullet and says that actually our moral character is itself the function, is itself a result of a choice. So there's a sort of choice by the transcendental subject. So outside of experience or before experience, there's a sort of choice. You sort of choose to be a cowardly person or a brave person or whatever other set of principles of that make up the character of a person. And so this is I think a pretty weird explanation of what it means, or what the relationship is between moral responsibility and character. It sort of it solves the problem by introducing this much bigger problem, I think, of what we could mean by a choice of character, and even further is the problem that this choice of character has to be done by a subject itself doesn't have any character. So there's no like if the character of the empirical subject is something that is determined by this choice of the transcendental subject, then the transcendental subject itself can't have any character, and then so it's not at all obvious how the transcendental subject is supposed to choose one character over another. There doesn't seem to be any basis for one choice over another. So it seems, in some sense, arbitrary which character would be chosen. You can choose a character that understands philosophy without any issues. That would be nice. But so Simondon was going to differentiate his position from this one of Kant's, and so he's going to suggest that the relationship between the transcendental subject and the empirical subject is one of problems to solutions, or something along those lines, so that instead of having the transcendental subject make this sort of choice outside of experience or before all experience, we instead have the transcendental subject, or the human, insofar as the human is a knowing subject and a rational agent, it sort of poses problems for themselves. So there would be problems of I don't know, whether to be brave or cowardly, I guess, would be a problem. And the empirical subject is a choice of those characters, or a solution to those problems. So it's not that the transcendental subject makes a choice prior to experience, but each empirical subject corresponds to a choice of solutions to those problems. So the transcendental subject is a sort of abstraction, or abstract entity, I guess, whereas the empirical subject is a concrete entity, or a particularized entity that is particularized in all respects, as opposed to the transcendental subject being this sort of universal that is not particularized. And then he introduces again this third term. So we have the empirical subject and a transcendental subject, or the individualization, or the individual as individualized, and the individual as individual. And then the third term is personality, and this is a sort of unification of these two previous terms. So the human being is not a pure individual or a purely individualized, but he says a mixture here, but I think he means more like a unification of the two. So he gives a brief allusion more than an example here, but he suggests that an example of individuation would be sexuality, and then an example of individualization is, or what we can understand by individualization, is the contingent events of everyday life. And then personality would be some sort of unification of the two. So it would be a situation in which a person's sexuality and their sort of contingent life history are both at work, or are both unified in that situation. Yeah, so this right, so we have this mixture, or what he calls a mixture, but I think unification might be better. Um, um, and then, so character, insofar as it appears in a human being, is always only part of this unification. So we never have this sort of purely appearing character in the way that Kant wanted us to have. And so we have this analysis of what we have in the translation here, unstable person, le caractériel. So in French, this term is related to the word for character, but here the idea is that this is a person who is indecisive, or who lacks, like in English we say someone lacks character, someone who doesn't sort of stand up for the principles that they claim to believe in, or that doesn't follow through on things that they promise to do, and so on. So this person is someone in whom the personality is not healthy, or not fully developed. So personality as the unification of this level of the individual and level of individualization, and this unification is not fully developed in this person, or has has decayed or gone awry in some sense. And then Angus had a question about right, about the point about sexuality. And sexuality would seem to be at the level of psychic individualization. And yeah, so this is maybe a point where the identification that I suggested between individuation and the vital on the one hand, and then individualization and the psychic on the other hand, I think that might sort of break down here. And so that's maybe why we can only really regard that as a sort of first approximation. So sexuality is something that sort of goes across the boundary between the vital and the psychic, right? So obviously there's a sexuality is something that exists in animals and plants and other organisms that are like aside from humans, and it's something that even in humans has a sort of vital aspect to it. So it's something that is related to our vital individuation. But then there's also a clear psychic aspect to it as well. Like it has to do with the way that we are organized as mental beings or psychic beings, so that sexuality sort of goes across the boundary of these two forms of individuation. And so yeah, this is sort of a problem case, I think, for that sort of clear distinction between the two. But I think what he means by saying that that sexuality is corresponds to the type of individuation rather than individualization is that insofar as someone belongs to a certain sex, or insofar as someone is a man or a woman, or insofar as they belong to that sex, they are not particularized as this individual man or this individual woman, or I should say this particular man or this particular woman. So they have a sex and they belong to that sex as something that is not particularized, and they're only particularized. Or sorry, I should say they have that sex as non-particularized, and then they only become particularized by sort of going beyond the level of sexuality into more particular details, I guess we can say. I'm not sure if that explanation makes sense, but it's so being a man or being a woman is a sort of generic property. It's not a particular property that distinguishes one particular person from another. I think that's the sense in which sexuality occurs at the level of individuation as opposed to individualization.
Well, that's a very difficult space to be in, to try to have explanatory power around, have a clarity in the explanation of what may be going on for Simondon. For one, there's definitely, I guess this is more of an individualization aspect, but it's the historical that's influencing, I think, Simondon in utilizing that as part of this case, or as an example, this how sexuality bound with the other property. Trying to find it here, what he coupled sexuality with as part of the individuation process. I think it's individuation. So I found that to be somewhat problematic on this topic, because he's having the influence, I think, of where he is in probably a spatio-temporal sense, leading him to utilize sexuality to enforce, or not to enforce, but reinforce his point. So that's my critique of that. I think there was a lot going on here. He always introduces another term too. It's like he elaborates on something, and then he's like, and then there's this, like, and then there's the interpersonal. It all leads the individuation and personality and stuff, and then there's another term. So he has these particular types of logic that he deploys. Which makes it complex, because it's obviously, there's a lot of complexity to the way he's organizing his arguments. It brings up a few different images for me as he goes through these kind of textual spaces. For one, I had a question around going back to the universality and the idea of, and how he then sort of weaves that into the synthesis, it seemed, of the transcendental ego or transcendental subject and the empirical subject. I guess I should pose a question. My question is, it says here, the subject as a result of individuation, that it incorporates a milieu of a prioris or priors. The subject as the milieu, an agent of the progressive discoveries of signification in the signals that come from the world, is the principle of the a posteriori, or the evidence in an empirical sense, the objects, for lack of a better word, the things that may be occurring in space. So I'm not quite sure how far he goes in distinguishing himself from Kant, actually, in this section. Because he says that the transcendental ego isn't really the particular arity or the state too much, I think, or well enough, because it's not clear to me whether the choice is something that we then experience as having made. We experience as having a choice, looking back on it through some sort of action that was taken by the empirical subject. So there's really no choice. It's kind of a passive thing that he seems to, and I could be wrong in my interpretation, I probably am, but it seems that it's kind of a passive state of the choice that exists for the transcendental subject. So that's where I don't necessarily know how he provides an explanation of how choice becomes a particular kind of knowledge. It seems there's a loophole where that particular type of knowledge around a choice is still something that the transcendental subject can contemplate, and yet the only experience of the choice can happen for the empirical subject. So maybe that's a question of point of clarification seems he attributes the experience of having made a choice through the empirical subject, as opposed
Right.
to a transcendental subject looking back and saying, or what I think you may have pointed out earlier in my interpretation, what you said earlier was the transcendental subject has this illusion of its subjectivity based on prior choices that it made. And so that's where I'm a bit confused around that term, the use of that term. And then, there's also the difficulty of the closing, where I started to sort of picture the coupling, the interpersonal coupling of two people, in terms of the discussion around personality, and then he introduces it as coextensive. I'm not sure if he meant in particular that that coextensiveness refers to a coupling, but he goes on to explain the ensemble of two people and what takes place with two people. And then his closing remark on that is definitely something maybe we can unpack. So there's a lot going on towards in this section. Maybe we want to start with the last thing and then, or with choice, but the last part of this is interesting too. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me about that last bit, because I didn't talk about that. So he talks about here the what is called the communication of consciousnesses, and this is a sort of term. I think we see this in 19th century psychology, or there was a whole late 19th century sort of renewal of interest in things like extrasensory perception, telepathy, and so on. And there were a number of scientists who tried to prove that telepathy existed or didn't exist, or investigate how it works and so on. And so this idea of a communication of consciousness is sort of tied to that idea, and there's the idea that there's some sort of relationship between one person and another, which goes beyond sort of communication in the normal sense of the term, but which is a sort of direct knowledge of each other's minds or something like that. And so Simondon here, what he argues is that there's what we can sort of describe as this communication of consciousnesses has to be understood in terms of something prior to consciousness. So this interpersonal relationship doesn't happen between two already constituted personalities or two already constituted people. It's only insofar as there's this pre-individual that is not yet constituted, that you can have something like a communication of consciousnesses. So some sort of shared understanding that goes beyond verbal communication. And so this communication of consciousnesses depends on something prior to consciousness, this pre-individual level, and then there would have to be this joint individualization, this community of individuation and of individualization between the two people, and this is what sort of gives us the phenomenon or the effect of communication of consciousnesses.
But I kind of pictured this last description in the more relational sense, where, let's say you have a couple, a man and a woman given the rest of this paragraph. And they sort of communicate or have these aspects of signals and signification that they may exchange through language back and forth, like let's say in a party setting where, and again, my interpretation of the individualization happens from an experience with the milieu. So the individual's individualization is dependent upon the empirical idea of a milieu. And so in this case, let's say you have a coupled relation. He kind of hints towards it or touches into the idea of the level of individualization that happens, or individuation that happens to a couple as one, given the level of communication that they have. And I kind of am refraining from the consciousness element of that communication, but it seems that he's sort of speaking to that kind of scene.
Yeah, one thing that is sorry to kind of keep coming back to this, but it seems like in this interpersonal relation point, he's talking about how there has to be a communication between both of the individuations as well as both of the individualizations. So that again is kind of unclear to me what the common individuation would be that would make interpersonal communication possible.
Yes, that reminds me too of what I was interpreting or sensing was that these two people that were part of the interpersonal relation had kind of lives of their own. He sort of describes it. It seems that he's describing on a philosophical level that they have this equanimity that involves their lives on their own, and they come back together, and there's this process that happens, but that they need to have these partial identities that makes their coupling possible. So, and the rest of their individuation happens outside of their participation in one another's lives on the interpersonal level, on a intimate interpersonal level, that allows them to have this sort of consciousness connection. Still requires their partial identities apart from their interpersonal relation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he wants to say that this communication of consciousnesses, if it's understood as some sort of full communication or full coextensivity of two consciousnesses, so it would be like one person is completely coinciding with the other person. He says this is rare, but it's not even clear that this is something that ever happens. It would seem that there's always, even in the most sort of united pair of people, or the most coextensive pair of people, you're always going to have some aspect of one person that is not shared with the other person. And so I think this communication of consciousnesses is to some extent illusory. So it's to the extent that it appears as if it's this full coextensiveness of the two consciousnesses. To that extent, it's illusory, and there's only a partially shared consciousness or partially shared domain and then each person has their own particular domain that is not shared with the other. But yeah, Angus raised a good point about trying to understand what the why there's this relation at the level of the individuation and at the level of individualization. So why is this relation happening at both levels? And I think I think he's not talking about the collective in the specific sense that he used the term earlier in this book, and that he's going to come back to in the next part of the book. I think he's thinking specifically of a couple or a close friendship or something like that, as opposed to some sort of as opposed to some sort of group phenomenon. But I think the level of individuation has to come into the picture here because there can't be, in order for something like a communication of consciousnesses, even in the partial sense, to happen, there can't be something like a completion of either of the people before they come into this relationship of communication of consciousnesses. So they have to be incomplete in some sense, and so that the level of individuation has to not be finished or not be completed before this before this relationship can occur. I think that's what he has in mind here, and so he talks about for personality, there can't be completed personality before the relationship. Yeah. So, and then personality, of course, is the unification of the level of the individuation and individualization. So, yeah, I think something along those lines, I think, is what he has in mind with that. Why individuation has to be part of the relationship in communication of consciousness. Yeah. So let's go on to the next subsection, which is a short one. We can probably read it in one go. I think it's one big paragraph. So if someone else would like to read from the heading, the relation to the milieu.
I can read that.
Sure, go ahead.
Section 2, the relation to the milieu. The interpersonal relation shares some resemblance with the relation to the milieu. However, the relation to the milieu forms either on the level of individuation or on the level of individualization. It is established on the level of individuation through emotion, which indicates that the individual being's principle of existence are called into question. Fear and cosmic admiration affect the being in its individuation and situate it within itself, once again relative to the world. These states consist of forces that challenge and call on the being to affirm its existence as an individuated being. This relation is situated on the level of individualization when it touches the being in its particularity through the property of familiar things or habitual and regular events, i.e., things and events that are integrated into the rhythm of life, are unsurprising and can be integrated into prior frameworks. The impression of deep participation or normal perception are the aspects of these two rapports. These two types of relation rarely combine, but instead succeed one another in life. On the contrary, the personality involves the presence of the two aspects, and the experience that corresponds to the personality is relative to two conditions. It partially involves challenging and questioning individuation, as well as a modification of individualization, thereby resulting in an integration into acquired frameworks. The relation to others calls us into question as an individuated being. It situates us in an encounter with other people as being young or old, sick or healthy, weak or strong, male or female. However, one is not absolutely young or old in this relation, but younger or older than another, and one is also stronger or weaker. To be a man or a woman is to be a man in a rapport to a woman, or a woman in a rapport to a man. To speak of simple perception is insufficient here. To perceive a woman as a woman is not to introduce a perception into pre-established conceptual frameworks, but to situate oneself both in terms of individuation and individualization with respect to her. This interpersonal relation involves a possible relation of our existence as an individual being with respect to her own. The perceived and the felt are only split off from one another in the illness of a personality. Minkowski brings up the case of a young schizophrenic who wonders why seeing a woman in the streets causes him a specific emotion. He sees no relation between the perception of the woman and the emotion he feels. However, the specific characters cannot suffice to explain the unity of the felt and the perceived, no more than habit or any other principle of exterior unity. The being's individuality can be effectively perceived. A woman can be perceived as having a specific particularity that distinguishes her from every other person. But it isn't a woman that she is distinguished in this way. She is distinguished qua human being or living being. The concrete knowledge, corresponding to a complete haeseity, this woman here, this very woman, is that in which individuation and individualization coincide. It is a certain expression, a certain signification that makes it such that this woman is this very woman. All the aspects of individuality and of individuation are incorporated into this fundamental expression that the being cannot have unless it is really unified. Gestalt psychology, which developed into a psychology of expression, considered signification as a basic reality. Signification is in fact given by the coherence of two orders of reality, that of individuation and that of individualization. The expression of a being is indeed a veritable reality, but it is not a reality that is graspable otherwise than as expression, i.e., as personality. There are no elements of expression, but there are bases of expression, since expression is a relational unity, maintained in the being by an incessant activity. That is the very life of the individual manifested in its unity. On the level of expression, the being is to the extent that it manifests itself, which is something that is not true for individuation and individualization.
Yeah, this is another very dense passage. There's a lot going on in this one long paragraph. Let me just go back up a little bit here.
My apologies to just really briefly about some of this.
Yeah, it's a bit of a strange text to read because there's always these long sentences with like 7 or 8 semicolons, and it's not always obvious how you're supposed to read that. But I think I think we should read those long sentences sort of in a series, like one sort of long series of clauses that are linked one to the other. I think that's sort of the cadence that he has in mind when he's writing these types of sentences. So I was going to say that here, so in the last section, we talked about the relationship of one consciousness to another, or one person to another. But here in this section, it's about the relationship to the milieu. So the relationship of a person to their milieu. And there's multiple, or there's at least two different ways that this relation happens, or two different levels at which the relation happens. So at the level of individuation and at the level of individualization. And so on the level of individuation, this is this relationship to the milieu takes the form of emotion. And so the examples that he gives here are fear or cosmic admiration. So these are states of the person that sort of call into question the individuation of that person. So your being as a person is brought into question, or is something that has to be reformulated or re-individuated at this level. Whereas for at the level of individualization, this has to do with the way that the milieu is incorporated into the sort of everyday pattern of existence. So the way that it fits in with your habits and your sort of everyday preferences and so on, the rhythm of your life in general. And then personality is again the integration of these two forms of relation to the milieu, or these two aspects of relation to the milieu. So in the sort of normal human being, we have both this emotional relation to the milieu that calls into question our individuation, and then we also have this sort of incorporation of the milieu into our habits and our everyday rhythm of life. And those two aspects are integrated with each other in some sort of coherent way. And sort of psychiatric disorders or disorders of personality would be some sort of incoherence of this relationship, so that in the case of the schizophrenic that he mentions here, the schizophrenic doesn't understand or doesn't see any sort of relationship between the emotional state that he feels and the perception of this woman in the street. He doesn't have this sort of coherent unification of the two sides, the emotional side and the incorporation into familiar categories side. And yeah, so that's sort of the first part of this section. And the second part, I think, has to do with the relationship between particularization and these the two sides of individuation and individualization. And so we see or they're sort of intertwined with each other, these two parts, or these two threads, I guess, of this section. But we have this relation to our environment or to our milieu, insofar as we belong to these categories, or insofar as we have these properties. So you're younger or older than another person, or to regard yourself as a man or as a woman is to oppose yourself to someone else as a woman or a man, to set yourself as an alternative, or as a difference from the other person. And yet at the same time, the particularity of someone. So this particular woman is not particular insofar as she is a woman, but insofar as she is a human being. So this particularization happens not at the level of these categories that we can sort of assign people to under these familiar patterns of life, but at the level of individuation. So there's a sort of reversal, I guess, or not quite a reversal, but a distinction between what's going on in this section and what was happening in the previous section, where we saw particularization or particularity in connection with individualization. But here we have particularity happening at the level of individuation. So it's I guess a different framing of how particularity happens or where particularity happens. And then there's also this bit right at the end of this section on expression. And so Simondon here is differentiating his position from Gestalt psychology and this this idea of expression as sort of the fundamental aspect of personality or of psychic reality. So for Simondon, it's only through sorry, how to put this? Expression is only graspable through perception, through personality. So it's only there isn't something like the real personality, which then is expressed in external actions or characteristics of some kind. The expression and the personality coincide with each other. There's no difference between the two. So their personality and expression are coextensive. And this is characteristic of the level of personality. So the unification of individuation and individualization, because at the level of the individual and at the level of individualization, there is not this same coextensiveness with manifestation. So there's it's only at the level of personality that expression and personality coincide in that same way.
Okay. I'd like to put on my psychoanalysis hat for just a moment and say a couple of things. One, this is a very interesting section where the one where he starts off and he gives the schizophrenic example by Minkowski, and then he weaves that into the erotic part of the middle of this text, where he gives this idea of this intimacy or high satiety experience with a woman. This woman here, this very woman, he gives as an object to be perceived in terms of closeness, but he refers to it as a concrete knowledge corresponding to a complete high satiety. Is that in which individuation and individualization coincide? And he refers to it as a certain expression, a certain signification that makes it such that this woman is this very woman. And I think at that moment he is encapsulating some of what he was talking about before about emotion and perception, right? He is kind of bringing us closer to, I think, his idea of perception that's happening at this kind of here and now moment where he describes this heterogeneous contact, closeness with this highest deity of a particular woman. And then he says that this fundamental expression cannot be had, I think, to summarize, unless it's really unified. So that brings up an interesting question of what could he have in mind when he is referring to how it becomes unified or more unified. And then the last point that I want to say is that he can't quite wrangle himself free of this Gestaltian example. And he kind of defers at the end. And maybe that's what leads to what he's going to talk about in the third section. But he does hold the fact that although, it seems to me that he's saying that although the Gestalt psychologists are onto something, and I picture it as a kind of an enactment, right? He's saying that the particularly the object of this woman, her expression cannot be grasped otherwise than as an expression of a personality, right? That the Gestalts would say that this expression is it is connected to or really is an expression of personality. And it seems like Simondon was saying, no, that may not actually be the case, although it may appear like that on the surface. He doesn't really go into what he calls it an incessant activity, right? A sort of maybe and then that this activity of expression is kind of an activity. He wants to also make this distinction about the basis of expression. So he wants to discern that the Gestalts refer to this expression of the personality as part of a misinterpretation of individuation, and that in fact they're pointing to a basis of expression, since expression is relational, and that there's and he maybe has some sort of contention with the fact that the Gestalts are referring to a relational unity, that this expression is a relational unity, and it seems like Simondon isn't happy with that being enough, that they're not going far enough, and that they're really not explaining it in its nuances the way individuation and individualization actually happens. So maybe he makes a strong case for that in the next section. But I think there's something personal going on here for Simondon in the text too. I might be I probably am reading into it quite a bit, but I think that a young schizophrenic person is that there's a kind of disavowal. And usually in schizophrenics, this is a very extreme thing, and I think there's definitely a continual a continuum kind of space. I see my time's up, okay. But yeah, in terms of the range of effectual processes that could be involved with individuation, I think for the schizophrenic experience, it's a very extreme thing where there's a disavowal and the various behavioral or personality enactments of not being able to have a quote unquote normative appropriate response to the emotion is sort of extreme. But anyhow, those are my comments and interpretation.
I think like an important thing here is like how we understand human being, like, and then the keywords, if I just pick on the three things, is like the personality and character, and then maybe you can think of the importance of like the concept of Haksari. According to Simongdong, like the moment the united moment of like individuation individualization is not that common. So like maybe we can call it the moment of Haksari, and the here and now, how the person is perceived, like externally, internally, like that may be called a character. Like a personality here, Simongdong uses it as a particular meaning, like kind of incomplete, kind of like a feature, which can change like inconsistently. Otherwise, on the other hand, like the character is like constitutes like a person's or individual, how do I say, like the identity, if I say. So the point here is that even a woman can be perceived as woman by other people, but the person would perceive herself as not the woman. Like, which means like sometimes individuation individualization doesn't go together. But there is a moment of Haksari, which like here and now, the person as a truth. So the point is that like as a consistently changing being, we can think of like the discrepancy between like the individuation individualization, but through the process, something new is like a continuously processed, produced, and then that's the whole point of the psychic individuation, like how a human being interacts with his or her own milieu, and then how express how what kind of expression is made, and how that could be different, like the true being of the human being, something like that. So I think we can more focus on the meaning, how like this Mungdong uses the concept of personality, the character, and the discrepancy between individualization, individuation, and the moment of Haksari. I think that's kind of a point of this part, and quite interesting, like intriguing, like definitely it must have been, so it must be related to the next part. Definitely we can find more in the next session.
Yeah, that's a good point about this possible discrepancy between internal and external, or between individuation and individualization. So you can have this. There's a possibility of like as you mentioned, like someone might be perceived as a woman, but not experience themselves as a woman, or any other traits that someone might be perceived as having. So I think for Simondon, this would be characterized as a sort of incoherence of personality. So it would be it's only in the case where you have this coincidence, or this coextensiveness of the internal and the external, that you would have personality in the proper sense, or a complete personality. So insofar as there's this discrepancy between individuation and individualization, it means that that person's personality is not, I guess, fully formed, or adequate to itself in some sense, and so this would generally sort of, I guess, serve as a kind of motivating principle for a person to want to try to integrate themselves and to want to have a coherent personality. This would be sort of a something that a person would strive towards. So I think when he talks about personality here, we can always think of this as something that that is not necessarily realized, but as something that we are sort of striving to achieve or striving to realize in our lives. So it's not, personality is not something that's given, but something that we have to try to achieve or try to realize.
Yeah, actually, I really would like to ask a question: what woman is like in terms of definition, or it? I think that this part reminds me of in a way like the word representation, like how we define particular personality, and then do we need to like like abide by or like conform to that kind of like a definition? Like I think like Simone is like cast a quite little fundamental question to the so-called expression, like the generally like shared perception about the being, like I don't know, like it maybe like has to do with like a human being is more like a becoming, not the being. Actually, that's kind of delusion, but definitely delusion was affected by this Mengdong. So the point is that how we like limit human being to the particular expression, like cause like there could be a variety of like so-called expressions. I'm not sure like the expression here is the right one, but there could be a variety of the forms, like as a result of like the in the mingling in the mix of the individuation individuation and individualization, something like that. So I think Simon Dong is a casting a fundamental question to that.
I think that's right. I think Simondon wants to move away from a conception of either character or personality as something that is a fixed like essence of a person, so that a person would have some sort of fixed character that that would be like the true reality, and then they would have expression of that character or of that personality as a sort of secondary phenomenon. He instead wants us to think of personality as something that exists only in its expression, and so this is something that is only realized through time, over the course of a lifespan. So we only ever have a personality insofar as we express a certain preference or a certain type of action or so on. And so there's this coextensiveness of expression and personality that I think he wants us to sort of reorient our understanding toward. Okay, so we're pretty close to time, and we're at a natural stopping point here at the end of this section. So I would suggest that we stop here for today, and then we can pick up at subsection 3 next time, if that works for everyone.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Okay, cool. So yeah, let's do that. Let me just put in the chat where we are so that I don't forget for next time. Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining in and for your participation, and hope to see you all next week.
Thank you so much. See you
Thanks,
next week.
John. Thanks, everyone.